Hi, everybody. It's Josh Becerra. Welcome to this next episode of How I Work. I am super excited about my guest today, Scott Baradell, writer and entrepreneur, grew a PR agency called Idea Grove with business. You generated all your business through a popular blog. And in 2020, you started a second blog called Trust Signals to provide news analysis and practical advice on what it takes to build trust with customers and the public in today's post-truth world. That's a big topic. Blog inspired and culminated in a book, Trust Signals, Brand Building in a Post-Truth World. And before Idea Grove, you were the chief communications officer for two different billion-dollar companies, co-founder and CMO of a venture-backed startup, and you are an award-winning journalist. Scott, I'm super excited to be doing this interview with you today.
Thank you for having me. I don't know if I can live up to that bio, but it's mostly true. But thank you for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. We're excited to hear what you have to say. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of trust in the post-truth world. So tell me why you believe that media coverage has become less of a driving force in building brand trust and reputation. And then what is that driving force today if it's not media coverage?
Well, that's a very good question. My agency obviously does digital marketing. I know that we're talking to digital marketers, and we work with SaaS clients. All we do is B2B tech, and SaaS is a decent chunk of that.
Yeah.
But my background was as a journalist and then as a PR person. And so coming from that background, the origins of PR 100 years ago were really the PR emerging as kind of a junior partner to the news media. There was a guy named Ivy Lee back in the early 20th century, and there were these railroads who were they were hated by the public because they would do things like there'd be fatal crashes, and not only would they not put out a press release, but they would deny it happened. They'd say, "What fatal crash? We don't know anything about your loved ones you can't find anymore." It was really like that, and that was at a time before that was when industries were coming bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the early 20th century, this progressive movement emerged where people for the first time started saying, wait a minute, we should have some say in this. If we don't like what you're doing, there's things like antitrust legislation now where we can break you up, big railroad or big oil company. So all of that led to the PR industry emerging. And how it emerged was there's a former journalist named Ivy Lee who said, you know what, let me counsel these railroad companies to not be such idiots and to say, hey, maybe we should actually do things like, and the first time this happened was he did it, bring journalists out to a crash site, actually tell them what happened, and he put out something called a Declaration of Principles, where he said, I'm not an advertising agency. My job is to get you the news and get you the truth. And the idea was, these big media organizations, the small number of media organizations that were known and respected by the public, they were the conduit for those railroad companies building better relationships with the public, having the small number of these big gatekeepers. And it was that way for many years since. You go into the 70s and 80s, you had Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News, Uncle Walty. There was a small number of media outlets and gatekeepers. And as long as the PR industry could have good relationships with those gatekeepers that would confer trust on their clients, then that's all they had to do. Just continue to be the junior partner of the media.
Well, now what's happening? A handful of people had a lot of kind of clout.
Yes.
Right? And there's a lot of trust.
Yeah. Well, now what's happened? Two things have happened. One is there's no small collection of gatekeepers anymore. It's very fragmented. There's so many different sources of information that people can get today. So which ones as a PR piece are most important? Which ones are most important to the audience? They're going to be different for everyone. And then when you talk about post-truth, the other complicating factor is you got about half the public that thinks half these sources are lying to you, right. and the other half thinks the others. So it's going to be different. So it's a very complex landscape to try to figure out how to make my brand be trusted. I used to just say, hey, I get it in the New York Times, then that's going to be this big boon, and people are going to think my company's a big shot company because I got in the New York Times. Now half the people are like, New York Times, that's fake news, right? I actually, this all started for me 10 years ago, 10 or 11 years ago now, where I had an oil and gas client. Of course, I'm in Dallas, Texas, so we have oil and gas clients, although most of my clients are B2B tech.
Yeah.
And they were an analyst firm. What they did was, they're still around, but they would analyze the performance of refineries and things like how are they doing in terms of energy efficiency, things like that. Kind of boring stuff, but interesting if you're kind of covering climate and things like that. So a reporter for the New York Times said, wow, what you guys are really, it's really fascinating. Can I interview the CEO? So this is huge. I got a reporter for the New York Times that wants to interview the CEO of my client, and I get it all set up. He agrees to do it. He's excited about it. She's coming down in person from New York. She books her flight. The day before, he calls me, kind of quavering, and says, I can't do this interview. I said, what are you talking about? Why you can't do this interview? Well, I've been talking to my clients. The big oil companies are his clients because they're an analyst firm that serves the big oil companies, and some of my other senior executives, and they're saying, no one trusts New York Times anymore.
Yeah,
they're not going to be fair to us. So I thought about it, and I thought, no, I've got this all set up. This is not. There's very little risk here. It's a topic that you'll come out fine on. But the larger thing that I started thinking about was, well, what if audiences in oil and gas don't really put much weight on a New York Times story, and a story in the Wall Street Journal or someone else means a lot more to them in terms of establishing what you're trying to achieve. And I honestly had never thought about it before. It was a hard lesson to learn, because that reporter never would respond to any email or any contact from me again after that. But I started following this, and it's only magnified since.
It's interesting. I love that you started with the kind of historical perspective, because it is like no trust in companies or brands, then PR and kind of news media because of the way it was formulated at the time, and there were just very few gatekeepers, high degree of trust. We kind of get a great deal of trust back into kind of brands and PR and the media, and now we're just like back in the dumps when it comes to trust in brands. So what are some of the ways that today's B2B marketers can inspire trust in this new kind of environment?
Well, what I did to start thinking about that is I started with something very tangible and simple. And people in B2B SaaS companies that say sell subscriptions to their services online, or have an e-commerce piece of their offering would know what I'm talking about. In e-commerce, there's something that's called trust that was been around for a long time. It was an early term in e-commerce, trust signals, which was things like very tangible things like having a Better Business Bureau seal on your site, or having a Norton security seal on your site. Those little, or free shipping, or money back guarantee. Those little seals or badges are things that were known as trust signals, that back in the earliest days of the internet, when people were trembling to put their credit card information on a website, it helped reassure them. Oh, I've heard of Better Business Bureau. They've been around since 1912. I guess it's yeah. So that, but what's interesting is those kind of trust seals are still on all those websites today. They still serve a very important function. And I started thinking more broadly in the same way that, say, a Norton security seal, or even a Visa logo. Oh, they accept Visa. The little things mean a lot to people when they're trying to decide to make a transaction. Those are what I call website trust signals. But there are other website trust signals that are a little less cut and dry, like, does your copy resonate? Is your navigation simple? If your navigation is confusing, I'm probably subconsciously thinking that when I get on the phone with your customer service, they're not going to understand what I'm talking about because
Yeah, what's going
you
on
didn't
here?
know how to show me
Yeah.
where to go. So all of these kind of unconscious signals that your website sends are not no different really from that seal. And you go beyond your website, you start thinking about customer reviews and media coverage and
Oh,
influencers
social
saying things
proof
about you on
side of
social
it.
media, social proof, all those things. I call them inbound trust signals. Those are little breadcrumbs of trust that bring you to the website. And then behind the scenes is a third kind of trust signal that I call SEO trust signals. Obviously, Google pays attention to all those other things, but Google has its own set of things that you
Right.
can't really see, like your domain age or um,
Load
there.
speed. Yeah.
Yes,
All those
though
kinds of things. Sure.
page speed. They're also looking at things like traffic to your site, since they obviously now with Google Analytics, they can
Yep.
make all kinds of assessments, and they determine basically you build this great website that looks beautiful, but it's going to be like you're having your business dinner in a fancy restaurant, but you're in a booth by the bathroom if you are 10 pages into results. So
Right.
it's more than traffic coming to your site. It's wow, if Google doesn't think much of you, maybe you're not that important.
Right.
So all of that constellation of things, I started thinking they're really all kind of a piece. So as a digital marketer or as a PR person, maybe what I should start thinking about is my goal is to figure out the right breadcrumbs of trust to bring people to my destination, my website, and they're going to be different for every brand.
Yeah, which
Um,
kind of brings me to my next question. And I think you hit on this with your story about like the New York Times versus the Washington Post. It's kind of like, how is it that then, you know, that CEO and their clients and their board of directors or whatever did not have faith in that certain like source, right? That certain source of news. So how is it that you would say a brand could go about uncovering like who their audience considers like a legit source of information?
Well, I mean, there's just no substitute for doing research. We work with a lot of mid-market companies, and they've got decent marketing budgets a lot of times, but they just don't want to spend it on research. And it's like ready, fire, aim instead of ready, aim, fire. I'll just give you an example. This is something that would have been a horrible decision by a brand if the research hadn't been done up front. In a few years ago, like 2018, is when Nike did this huge advertising campaign built around Colin Kaepernick, right?
Yep, I
Colin
remember.
Kaepernick, highly controversial figure, right? Um, and when it came out, there's a boycott Nike hashtag on social. There were people
People were
burning.
burning their
Yeah,
shoes, right? I remember
but
that.
but do you think Nike was worried about it? No, because they had done their research. They knew their customer, and they knew that choosing sides on this issue, knowing who their customer was, that it would only build a stronger relationship between their customers and their brand. And it worked. They came back to their shareholders and were able to come back and say, attribute lots of revenues and share
Oh,
price
yeah.
growth to that specific campaign. So it's much better to do your research than to just go with the CEO's gut. But what we find is too many companies still just want to go with the CEO's gut. We had a client during COVID that had this really cool application. I don't want to be too specific about it. That let's just say it was very TV friendly. So we felt like we could get TV coverage for it. And he said, no, I only want to, I'll be on the local stations, but don't pitch me to CNN or blah, blah, blah. That's all fake news. I just want to be on Fox Business Network. Like, well, wait a minute. You
Yeah.
think that, but from what I can tell, there's nothing about your product that would skew it towards Fox's audience versus CNN's.
Yeah,
So
certain.
wouldn't you want to be on both? So that's why it's just like what happens is if you don't do your research, then you make gut calls and use intuition and things that probably not the best basis for deciding where to put your marketing dollars.
Yeah, amen to that. And there are opportunities to even like test some of that messaging with audiences in little ways where you don't have to make this like huge splash. You can kind of figure out like how's this going to resonate, and how are people going to react to it. And so I do think that like at least from a Gurian standpoint, we're all about like experimentation and learning. And so if you can figure out ways to do like some of that message testing through digital, because you can get to the answer quite a bit faster if you're willing to kind of set it up correctly and pay for it, right?
That's so true. There's so many ways that you can test, like you're exactly what you're describing. And then there's so many listening tools. Obviously people are familiar with like social media listening tools and stuff, and they're available at all different kind of price points. But we found there's all kinds of things out there now with AI. We found this little company out of England, and what they do is they essentially they do not necessarily sentiment analysis so much as just language analysis. So they'll be able to figure out, say, you versus your competitors, looking at Twitter, looking at reviews on review sites, what words are used to characterize you versus a competitor. And then you can start thinking about, gosh, they're using these words, but for some reason, I'm not using those words on my website. Maybe I should be using those words. And I'll confess something. One of the things that we found when we did our own analysis is we got lots of good feedback, and the word partner came up a lot when people were referring to their relationship with us as an agency. But what we found was really interesting is that our competitors, way more than us, had terms like fun. And like, we're not fun, but it made us think about it's like, well, why is our competitors 5 times or more likely to have fun, the word fun associated with them? You know what I mean? So this kind of analysis is so helpful. So should we be doing things to be more fun? It made us be introspective about it. And if we hadn't used that specific, I think a normal social listening tool wouldn't have found it, but this very specific language AI tool did. And as you know, as all the discussion about AI lately, new tools are emerging every day, which means I don't have to pay a bunch of money for a focus group or spend a ton of money on quantitative research to really get some good intelligence about what people think about me.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm having a lot of fun with this interview. So you're doing a great job. And but we are getting short on time. So I got one more question. Which is I noticed like consistent theme in your book around your grow with trust philosophy. Can you explain what that means or how someone would put this into practice?
Yeah, what I wanted to do is, I list on my website like over 100 different trust signals, like all these little things like the trust signals and different things.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what I did a webinar for a bank in Texas. They're actually our bank, and they asked me to talk to small business owners and stuff. And the question was
fun to me.
Yeah, the question was, that's a lot of different stuff. How do I know what to prioritize, what to do first? And so I thought the best thing to do was to put it in a system where all of these were organized under solutions. To make it simple, I made an acronym, TRUST, and the 5 solutions within TRUST are third-party validation, like media coverage or customer reviews, reputation management, that's kind of protecting your backside, user experience, that's having a website that resonates with people, that has trust seals, all those things, search visibility, so you're not in the booth by the bathroom on Google, and then thought leadership, because if you don't have a thought leadership line of communication out there, you end up mostly just talking about yourself, and you're like that person at the party that just talks about themselves, and so people just want to go find the bar. So thought leadership gives you that relief valve, so you can say smart things, but without always talking about yourself. So we basically take all the different trust signals, organize them that way. We call it the acronym TRUST. And so we tell our businesses that if you'll use the system, you can grow with trust. That's it.
Like that's super smart. Not just, just the acronym spells trust. We're talking about trust signals. Scott, this has been an amazing interview. So everybody needs to go out and buy this book, Trust Signals, Brand Building in a Post-Truth World. I really do appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
This has been fun. Thank you so much.